The authors of the New Testament quote Scripture a lot. In fact, the New Testament authors quote the Old Testament directly just over 300 times, allude to it nearly 500 times, and make further possible allusions just over 100 times. The text of the New Testament is fully steeped and saturated in the Old Testament. But the Old Testament was written in Hebrew and the New Testament authors were writing in Greek. So, what were the New Testament authors quoting? A lot of the time, although not all of the time, they were quoting what's often called the Septuagint, which was one of the streams of the Greek translation of the Old Testament. At a very basic level, the term Septuagint, often abbreviated in print form with the Roman numerals LXX, is typically used to refer to a collection of ancient translations of the Hebrew Bible and a handful of other Jewish Greek texts. Those other Greek texts we refer to as the Apocrypha. I talk about what the Apocrypha is in a previous video titled Why Do Catholics and Protestants Have Different Books in their Bibles? So you can go back and check out that particular video and that subject there. But getting back to the Septuagint, one of the issues we fall into is the trickiness of branding it as a single document. In reality, there wasn't one Septuagint, and there were actually other streams of Greek translational texts of the Old Testament that follow alongside the Septuagint. It's more accurate to describe the Septuagint as a collection of translations more than it is a single unit. It is also too easy to conceptualize the Septuagint as a standalone single-volume hardback produced in its entirety by one single translation committee working with a shared philosophy, much like is the case of modern Bible translations today. But doing so, intentionally or not, is a serious mistake. The layered corpus of Greek texts and textual traditions that make up what we now call the Septuagint were translated by different people in different locations at different times for different purposes, often with different Hebrew texts, and in many cases, more than once for a particular book. At no point in antiquity, that we know of at least, was there any term used to identify those texts as a unified corpus distinct from the Hebrew Scriptures in general. This is why some scholars, like Peter J. Williams at Cambridge's Tyndale House, have somewhat cheekily said that they don't even believe in the Septuagint. It's not that Williams and others deny that there was a stream of Greek translations of the Old Testament. In fact, their issue with using the term is that there clearly is such a stream. One of the issues that scholars like Williams have is the problem with taking such a diverse group and then proceeding to label it under one term without realizing the plurality and diversity within. His worry is that confusing to it as such would confuse people who don't understand the complexity that goes into the category. Nonetheless, we can deduce from the historical record that in Egypt around the 3rd century BC, the first 5 books of the Bible, what are known as the Torah, were translated from the Hebrew into the Greek. By this point in history, the Jewish community in Egypt was thoroughly Hellenized, and Greek was a primary language that they would have been reading and speaking. Just as we are not reading our Bibles in their original Hebrew and Greek, most ancient Jews read their scriptures in the language they were likewise far familiar with. Translation itself was certainly not an unusual part of the multilingual context of Hellenistic Egypt, and there is good evidence that those who produced the first editions of the Greek Old Testament were either professional translators in the Ptolemaic administration themselves, or they consulted with those who were. Although the main motivation for translating the Hebrew Bible was probably internal to the Jewish community, it is very possible that some external motivation also played a role. One ancient account of this story appears in the Letter of Aristeas, a 2nd century AD document framed as an eyewitness account of why and how the Jews produced the Greek Torah. It's in this letter that we get the name from, Septuagint being the Latin word for 70. The story stated that 70 Jewish scholars, 6 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, produced independently from one another the exact same translation of the Hebrew Scriptures in Greek. Now, scholars today take this story not very seriously. and unanimously regarded as fictitious. However, there was and has been some credibility given to the timing of the event. The first 5 books of the Old Testament appear to have been indeed translated from Hebrew into Greek somewhere in the 3rd century BC. It's generally recognized that most of the other books of the Hebrew Scriptures, including the historical book, prophets, along with the Psalms, were translated by the mid-2nd century BC. Other books, like Ecclesiastes, however, may not have been translated at all until well after the turn of the era. Remember again that I mentioned the trickiness of using a single word like Septuagint to describe such a varied grouping of texts. Trying to describe the Septuagint as a whole in simple terms is similar to trying to, say, describe the climate of the entire continent of North America in a single sentence. The culture here in Canada, where I personally live, varies depending on what province you're in, what area of what province you're in, and even whether you're, say, north or south within that province. Newfoundland is very different than Toronto, which is very different from Calgary, which likewise has nuances that are quite different than somewhere like Vancouver. And each of those cities could depend on where you are in that city itself. That's of course not even factoring in how different these Canadian areas can be from those in the United States, and how each state in the US holds different cultural angles depending on what state you're from. That's also not to mention that bringing Mexico into the mix might even complicate the North American context further. And broad brushing the Septuagint could be just as unhelpful in some instances as broad brushing North America. Saying anything useful really depends on what part you're looking at. Because the Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible emerged gradually over 3 centuries, rather than all at once, the copying and transmission of these written texts themselves influenced the production of later books, as misunderstandings or disagreements occurred. When I got feedback on my video regarding the differences between the Protestant and Roman Catholic Old Testament, again and again Catholics would tell me that the Septuagint included these other books in their canon, and so therefore it was the Protestants who removed them. The problem is, these were all independent books, and the issue of the canon in this regard is more complex than simply including it under the term Septuagint and ending the conversation there. Our labeling these writings as the Septuagint, while maybe being useful in their distinction, runs the danger of creating an image of a single unit for these various texts that fall under the umbrella term. The ancient reader would never have understood all of these books as a single book like we have today in, say, a modern Bible. We do have discussions of canon lists in the Jewish community of antiquity, like that of Josephus and Against Appian, but none of these others recognize a canon broader than the Hebrew Bible, known and recognized by both modern Protestants and Jews today. As I said at the beginning of the video, one of the most important areas of the Septuagint's importance is that it was clearly what the New Testament authors were reading and quoting. Now, we need to be careful and must avoid the thinking that the New Testament author somehow walked over to his bookshelf and pulled off the Septuagint in order to source it. There was no single understanding or volume-bound Septuagint. There was scripture, preserved in better or worse forms in Greek. For this reason, the textual, linguistic, and even theological implications of the Septuagint for New Testament studies comprises a dense and important scholarly field of research. For example, there is ongoing debate within Septuagint scholarship as to the prevalence of theological tendencies manifested in the Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible itself. The same can be said about the nature and meaning of innumerable features of the language of the Septuagint. But aside from grappling with such issues directly, New Testament scholars have the added complexity of asking whether and how the New Testament authors themselves might have read and understood the Greek versions of the Hebrew Bible, and what kind of influence that might have had, in textual form or vocabulary choice, for example, upon their interpretive posture and scriptural reasoning. There appear to be places where a New Testament author seems to choose a Greek reading that differs with a Hebrew one when they've previously sourced the Hebrew reading in their allusions. This, in some instances, may raise more questions, but in others, help clarify what these texts look like in the days of Jesus. Now, it should be clear at this point that the Septuagint is a broad and complex area of study. We should avoid oversimplifying it as we think about the textual history of the Bible, lest we come to unwarranted conclusions. Yet even so, with some guidance and understanding, the Septuagint is not beyond the grasp of the typical person to understand who wants to explore the origins of Scripture. As I've said in previous videos, Scripture was not written to us. It had a different audience, but it was written for us. By understanding who it was written to in the original audience and how the author intended their immediate readers to understand it, it can help us proceed in applying the words of Scripture to our own lives. Understanding the what and the where and the how of the Septuagint plays into our understanding of the discussion and how we can better fill in the gaps in the context of what the Bible is to begin with. And if you want to learn more about these types of topics related to the Bible, biblical history, and apologetics, then check out the rest of my videos and content on my channel. And don't forget to subscribe so you're made aware of new content as it drops.